Chapter 6. The quiet sounds of the camp woke me up, and for a moment, I was disoriented. I realized that I was all by myself in the wagon, the constant, steady sound of Ryke's breathing absent for the first time in the weeks we had been with the wagon train. My mind drifted to what happened last night, and I squeezed my legs together, feeling the evidence of our encounter in the slightly aching muscles between my thighs. I heard the wagon flap gently open, followed by the clanging of metal pots and cups, then it closed again. I sat up and stretched, my body feeling heavy and electrified at the same time. I needed a wash before we got back on the road. The air inside the wagon was thick with the scent of him, that heavy cedar and wood smoke musk that seemed to have woven itself into the very fibers of the blankets. I sat there for a long minute, my fingers tracing the indent in the bedding where he had been lying just hours ago. The memory of his hands, those broad, calloused palms that had memorized the curve of my waist, sent a fresh ripple of heat through me. I felt changed, a subtle but fundamental shift in the architecture of my own body. For years I had been a creature of utility, every movement and every breath calculated for survival. But last night had been something else entirely. It had been a reclamation. I pulled on my clothes with trembling fingers, my skin still sensitive to the touch of the coarse wool. The camp was just beginning to stir, the low murmur of voices, and the occasional crackle of a rekindled fire floating through the canvas. I gathered my small bundle of soap and a clean cloth, my movements fueled by a sudden, desperate need for the clarity of cold water. I needed to wash the scent of him off me, or perhaps I just needed to prove to myself that I was still Maris, the woman who was willing to start a new life in a foreign place I had never seen, and not just an extension of the man who had claimed me in the dark. I slipped out of the wagon and moved toward the sound of the river. The morning light was thin and silver, casting long, ethereal shadows across the tall grass of the plains. I found a spot a few hundred yards downstream where the water pooled into a calm, glassy circle protected by a wall of high, smooth boulders. It was a cathedral of stone and water, silent and sacred, in the early hour. I stripped quickly, the biting chill of the air making my skin pebbled, and stepped into the water. The cold was a shock, a sudden and violent reset. I submerged myself completely, letting the current flow through my short strands, and the ice-cold pressure squeeze the air from my lungs. When I surfaced, gasping, I felt the fog of the night begin to lift. I scrubbed my skin until it was red, focusing on the physical sensation of the water, trying to ignore the way my mind kept looping back to the guttural sound of his voice in my ear. I was reaching for my cloth when a shadow fell across the rocks. I didn't scream. I had learned a long time ago that screaming rarely helped. I simply sank lower into the water to cover my naked body, my eyes narrowing as I looked toward the silhouette standing at the entrance to the pool. It was Ryke. He wasn't dressed for the road yet. He wore only his dark trousers, which were unbuttoned, his chest bare and the bandages around his middle stark white against his tanned skin. He looked like something carved from the earth, ancient and immovable. He didn't speak. He just watched me with those amber eyes, the light in them catching the morning sun until they looked like molten gold. "You should be resting," I said, my voice sounding thinner than I wanted. "I rested enough," he replied. His voice was a low vibration that seemed to travel across the surface of the water and settle directly in my marrow. Without another word, he fluidly stripped away the rest of his clothing, standing before me in his naked glory. I gasped, the sound echoing off the stone walls. He was a beautiful sight to see, a landscape of hard muscle, healing scars, and raw, masculine power. There was nothing hesitant about him. He stepped toward the water's edge, his movements fluid and predatory. There was no trace of the wounded man I had dragged from the riverbank weeks ago. This was the commander, the man who had led armies and conquered cities, and he was looking at me like I was the only objective that mattered. He didn't stop at the bank. He stepped into the pool, the water rising around his ankles, then his knees, as he walked toward me. "Ryke, someone will see," I whispered, though the protest felt hollow even to me. "Let them look," he growled, the sound sending a pleasant shiver through my body that had nothing to do with the temperature of the river. He reached me in 3 long strides, his hands coming down to grip my shoulders and pull me toward him. The contrast between the freezing water and the furnace heat of his skin was enough to make my head spin. He backed me against the largest of the boulders, the stones smooth and cold against my spine, and pinned me there with the weight of his body. The encounter was not like the night before. Last night had been a discovery, a quiet and desperate collision in the dark. This was a claim. He moved with a focused, masculine intensity that left no room for hesitation. His mouth found mine, a jagged and hungry kiss that tasted of salt and the wild, open air. I reached for him, my fingers digging into the hard muscles of his back, anchoring myself as the world dissolved into the sound of rushing water and the frantic beat of my own heart. "Gods, Maris, I have wanted you since I first laid eyes on you in Mantua," he growled against my skin, his voice thick with a hunger that seemed bottomless. He lifted me, my legs locking around his waist as he pressed me harder against the rock. The stone was unforgiving, but I didn't care. I wanted the pressure. I wanted the certainty of him. He was a force of nature, a storm that I had invited in, and as he moved with me, the morning light dancing off the spray of the water, I felt a sense of power that had nothing to do with gold or knives. High above on the ridge, a small figure stood frozen, unnoticed by both of us. When the world finally slowed down, Ryke rested his forehead against mine, his breathing heavy and ragged. He didn't pull away immediately. He held me there, his hands steady on my hips, as the water swirled around us. I looked at him, really looked at him in the clear, unforgiving light of the morning. I studied the way his brow was shaped, the particular curve of his jaw, and most of all, the color of his eyes. "You have the exact same shade of eyes as Robin," I said, the observation slipping out before I could check it. Ryke's expression shifted instantly. The warmth vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp annoyance that flickered across his features like a blade. He let go of me, stepping back into the shallow water. "You have been spending way too much time with the wagon train master if you are studying the color of his eyes so closely," he said, his voice clipped and harsh. "It was just an observation, Ryke. Don't be ridiculous." "I am not being ridiculous. I am being observant," he countered, reaching for his clothes on the bank. "He is a traitor. I am your brother. Keep your eyes on the road and off the master." He turned, shrugged on his clothes and walked away without another word, leaving me standing in the cold water, shivering and confused by the sudden wall he had built between us. The journey back to camp was silent. By the time I arrived, the wagons were already being hitched, and the first of the scouts were riding out. I went straight to our wagon, trying to act as if I hadn't just been pinned against a rock in the middle of a river, but the atmosphere in the camp felt different. Heavy. I noticed it first with Sable. Usually, she would offer a small wave or a quiet good morning as I passed. Today, she wouldn't even look at me. When I stepped near the communal fire to grab a piece of bread, she practically jumped back, her face twisting as if she had smelled something rotting. She gathered her things and hurried toward Petra's wagon, her movements jerky and panicked. I endured it for 2 hours on the road, watching her from the front of my wagon, as she rode her small pony as far away from me as possible. Finally, during a brief stop to check a loose harness, I caught her behind the supply cart. "Sable, what is wrong with you?" I asked, stepping into her path. "You've been acting like I'm a leper all morning." Sable looked at me, and for the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. Not fear of what I might do to her, but fear of what I was. "I saw you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "At the river. This morning." My heart stopped. The blood drained from my face so fast the world tilted. "Sable, it's not what you think," I began, but the lie felt like ash in my mouth. "I saw what you were doing with him, Maris. With your own brother," she said, her voice rising with a hysterical edge. "I don't know what kind of animals you people are up in Cantalos. Maybe sleeping with your siblings is normal where the snow rots your brains. But in Andolin, it is a crime. It is a filth that we do not tolerate. It is highly frowned upon by the gods and the law alike. If anyone else finds out, they will cast you out of this convoy and leave you for the wolves. Or worse." She looked at me with such pure, unfiltered loathing that I couldn't even find the words to defend myself. I stood there, mortified and paralyzed by the sheer weight of the misunderstanding. My lie, the clever little story I had crafted to protect Ryke's identity, had turned us into perverts in the eyes of the only people helping us. I wanted to scream the truth, to tell her he was a warlord, a stranger, a man I had found in the mud, but I couldn't. The truth was a death sentence for him. The lie was a social death for me. "Don't come near me again," Sable said, her voice cold. "And keep that monster away from the other women. We aren't your kind." She brushed past me, leaving me standing in the dust of the road. I felt sick. I felt like I had walked into a trap of my own making. I went back to the wagon and sat on the bench, my hands shaking as I took the reins. Ryke was driving our wagon now, a permanent scowl on his face, oblivious to the storm I had just weathered, probably still brooding about Robin's eyes. The day dragged on in a blur of humiliation and silence. Every time I saw Sable whisper to Petra or Odell, I felt a fresh spike of panic. I kept my head down, staring at the back of the wagon in front of us, wishing the earth would open up and swallow the entire convoy. When evening finally came, and we pulled into a sheltered grove for the night, I stayed in the wagon. I didn't want to see their faces. I didn't want to see the way they looked at me. I sat in the shadows of the interior, listening to the sounds of the camp settling. Ryke had gone out of the camp earlier, saying something about needing air. A few minutes later, I heard voices just outside the canvas. "The road ahead is thinning." Robin's voice was unmistakable, clear and authoritative. "The scouts say there are tracks of Dhoran patrols near the border. We need a team that can move fast and stay quiet. I'm putting a scouting party together for the midnight watch." "I'll go," Ryke's voice answered. It was steady, devoid of the annoyance from earlier. I know how they move. I can see them before they see us. I don't doubt that, Robin said. There was a long pause, the kind of silence that held a physical weight. I've been thinking about what you said, Ryke, about working with your hands in Cantalos. It's a fine story. Very convincing. I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. It's the only story I have, Ryke replied. Is it? Robin's voice dropped an octave, becoming something sharper, more dangerous. Because I don't think a shopkeeper's assistant from the north knows the tactical formation of a Dhoran vanguard, and I certainly don't think he carries himself like a man who has commanded thousands. Isn't that right, General Ryke Vandross of the Iron Legion? The silence that followed was absolute. Not even the wind dared to move. I felt the air leave the wagon, my lungs seizing at the sound of his name, his real name, spoken with such casual certainty. And the girl, Robin continued, his voice unrelenting. Maris. She's quite skilled at playing the sister. But the way she watches the horizon, the way she flinches at the sound of a whip, it's not the mark of a merchant's daughter. She's a former slave, isn't she? I've seen the look before. It stays in the eyes long after the chains are gone. And that healing ear is a tell too. My people won't be able to notice it, because slavery is illegal in Andolin. But I've spent a lot of time trading in this kingdom. I know a lot. I closed my eyes, tears of frustration and fear pricking at the edge of my lids. My hand reached instinctively for my ear. He knew. He had known for a long time. Ryke didn't answer for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. It wasn't the voice of the man who had joked with me, or the man who had pinned me to a rock. It was the voice of a man who had nothing left to lose. You are right about my identity, Ryke said, the words falling like stones. I am who you say I am. Or who I was. But you are wrong about her. Maris was never my slave. She is my savior. She pulled me from a river when she could have left me to drown and taken my gold. She stitched me back together while the world was hunting me. She is the only reason I am breathing. I felt a sob rise in my throat and choked it back. I won't cause you any trouble, Robin, Ryke continued. I have no interest in your trade or your secrets. I have been an outsider in Dhoran my entire life. I have fought for a king who hated me since I was a boy, and a country that didn't want me. I want to live a quiet life in Andolin. My mother was from there. I am going home. The silence stretched again. I could almost see Robin standing there, weighing the life of a fallen warlord against the safety of his convoy. Your mother was from Andolin? Robin asked, his voice losing its edge, replaced by a strange, hollow curiosity. What was her name? Flara, Ryke said. Flara? Robin asked, sounding shocked. Yes. Just Flara. Her name and the fact that she is from Andolin is all I know about her. She died when I was 5, and I didn't get a chance to know more. The silence that followed this name was different. It wasn't tense or dangerous. It was heavy, as if the name itself held a ghost that had just walked into the center of the camp. I waited for Robin to speak, for him to offer a threat or a welcome or a question, but nothing came. I heard the soft crunch of gravel as Robin turned and walked away without a single word. Ryke stood outside for a long time after he was gone. I sat in the dark of the wagon, my mind racing through everything that had just happened. The eyes, the name, the mother, the pieces of a puzzle I didn't even know I was solving began to click into place, but the picture they formed was terrifying. Impossible. I thought of the stories about an attack decades ago on Andolin traders, which wiped them all out without a trace, the kind of stories traders like to exchange, exaggerating them with ghost stories. When Ryke finally climbed back into the wagon, he didn't look at me. He sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. He knows, I whispered. He does, Ryke replied. What do we do? He looked up then, and the expression on his face was one I had never seen before. It wasn't fear. It was a profound, weary sadness. We keep moving, Maris. It's the only thing we've ever been good at. I reached out and took his hand, my fingers lacing with his. The physical connection was a lifeline in a world that was rapidly turning upside down. We were no longer just a slave and a soldier. We were two ghosts haunted by our pasts, heading toward a kingdom that might be our salvation or our final grave. Outside, the plains remained silent, the stars overhead indifferent to the secrets buried in the heart of a merchant's wagon. We lay down together, not to touch or to claim, but simply to exist in the same space, waiting for the light of a morning that felt further away than ever. The next day, the tension in the convoy was a physical thing. Sable continued to treat me like a plague bearer, her whispers spreading through the group like a slow-acting poison. Petra's gaze had turned from practical to suspicious, and even the brothers, Cass and Odell, seemed to have lost their appetite for arguing. They all watched us, waiting for the moment the scandal would break, or the danger would manifest. But Robin said nothing. He rode at the head of the convoy, his back straight, his eyes fixed on the western horizon. He didn't look back at our wagon once. He didn't speak to me, and he didn't speak to Ryke. It was as if he had retreated into a fortress of his own making, a place where none of us knew what was happening. I realized then that the Purple Sea was more than just a body of water. It was a boundary between the people we were forced to be and the people we actually were. And as we rolled closer to the salt air and the high cliffs, I knew that the truth would eventually demand its price. I just didn't know if I had enough gold left to pay it. Chapter 7. The suspicion in the camp had become a physical weight, a thick layer of frost that never melted even under the relentless heat of the afternoon sun. I felt it every time I walked toward the water barrels or reached for a shared ladle of the evening stew. The conversations would die mid-sentence, replaced by a stabbing silence that followed me like a dark, persistent shadow. Sable was the center of it, the orchestrator of the quiet judgment. Her eyes tracked my every movement with a look of such profound moral injury that I felt like a criminal just for existing within her line of sight. It was a peculiar kind of isolation, being surrounded by dozens of people yet existing in a vacuum of silence. Ryke seemed to feel the shift as well, though his reaction was far different from my own internal shrinking. He did not turn away or lower his gaze when the whispers started. Instead, he simply became more still, more lethal in his quietness, and that cold focus made the other travelers string away from him like sheep avoiding a wolf. There had always been a dominating presence when it came to him, a gravity that pulled the air out of a room, but now his presence was a dark anchor in the middle of our small wagon. He carried himself with the poise of a man who was used to being the most dangerous thing in any given space, and the camp had finally begun to sense the teeth behind his silence. One night, after the camp had finally gone quiet and the only sounds were the distant lowing of the oxen and the crackle of the dying perimeter fires, we were tucked away in the sanctuary of the wagon. The world outside felt miles away, separated from us by the thin canvas walls that acted as our only shield. We had just finished making love, our bodies tangled together in the cramped space, the heat of our skin providing the only real warmth in the cooling night. Ryke lay beside me, his hand gently tracing slow, intricate patterns on my back while I pressed my ear to his chest, counting the reassuring, rhythmic thumps of his heartbeat. The intimacy should have brought a sense of absolute peace, but I could still feel the tension radiating off him like heat from a forge. He reached out and tilted my face toward him, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw with a gentleness that always surprised me. It was a touch that belonged to a different man, one who hadn't spent his life in the muck of battlefields. "Why have you been looking so miserable, Maris?" he asked, his voice a low rumble in the dark that vibrated through my own bones. I sighed, leaning into his touch even as the memory of the day's humiliations flooded back. "It is the camp, Ryke. Sable saw us at the river. She thinks we are siblings, remember? I told that lie to protect you, but now everyone looks at me like I am something unholy. They do not talk to me anymore. They do not even like being near me when we stop for the night. I can feel their skin crawl when I pass by. They think we are monsters." Ryke's hand went still against my face. The air in the wagon seemed to sharpen instantly, the temperature dropping a few degrees as his expression shifted into something cold and tactical. The lover vanished, replaced by the soldier. "I can kill all of them," he said. His tone was as casual as if he were suggesting a different route to the coast, or commenting on the quality of the grain. I snorted at first, waiting for the punchline, thinking it was some dark, dry humor he was using to distract me. But the laughter died in my throat when the punchline never came. I looked up at him, and my breath caught. His amber eyes were flat and serious, devoid of any humor or hesitation. He was not joking. He was offering me a functional solution. A battlefield clearance of everyone who had made me uncomfortable. "Ryke, no! You cannot be serious," I whispered, my heart starting to race with a new kind of alarm. "You cannot just murder the people who are helping us get to Andolin, because they are being rude and judgmental. They are families, Ryke. They are just traitors." He shrugged, though the movement was tight and controlled, his muscles coiling beneath his skin. "I do not like seeing you sad. I have spent my life being called a bastard, an outsider, a monster. I do not mind the sneering or the aversion directed at me. I have lived in that coldness since I was a child. It is my natural climate. It is the only weather I have ever known. But you were not made for it. You have enough burdens to carry without their silent daggers. If their tongues are causing you pain, I can simply silence them. It would be easy. I could finish it before the moon sets." "Do not," I said, grabbing his wrist and squeezing as hard as I could, trying to anchor him to the reality of the life I wanted for us. "Promise me, Ryke. We are trying to start a new life. We are trying to find a home where we do not have to hide. We cannot do that if we leave a trail of bodies across the plains. We just have to endure it until we reach Andolin. Once we are there, we can leave this convoy and never see these people again." He watched me for a long time, the conflict visible in the set of his jaw and the hard line of his mouth, Finally, he gave a slow, reluctant nod. As you wish. But understand this, Maris. If one of them touches you, if one of them moves beyond whispers and puts a hand on you in anger, the promise is void. I will wipe everyone out. I will burn this camp to the ground and leave nothing but the crows to tell the story. The intensity of his protection was both a comfort and a terror. Before I could respond, a sharp, rhythmic scratch sounded against the outside of the wagon canvas, startling me. Vandross! Get up. It is your turn for the midnight watch, a voice called out from the darkness. It was one of the men from the security detail, his voice filled with a familiar, weary irritation. Ryke froze, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the canvas. He looked back at me, his gaze lingering on the way the dim lamplight hit my shoulders and the curve of my neck. For a moment, he looked as though he was going to refuse, his protective instinct warring with the need to keep our cover intact. He clearly did not want to leave me alone in a camp that viewed me with such open hostility, especially after what we had just discussed. Go, I encouraged him, pushing gently against his chest. I will be fine. I am going to sleep. It is just a few hours. Go and do your duty, so they have one less thing to complain about. If you stay here, it only gives them more reason to whisper. He let out a long, frustrated breath and began to pull on his clothes with efficient, practiced movements. He did not speak as he buckled his belt and checked the weight of the blade at his side, but the way he looked at the wagon flap was enough to tell me that anyone who approached while he was gone would be lucky to keep their head. He slipped out into the night without a sound, and I lay there in the dark, wondering how I had ended up tied to a man who saw the world in such simple, violent terms. I felt the weight of his love like a heavy cloak, warm but suffocatingly thick. The following morning I woke with a sense of dread, bracing myself for the usual gauntlet of dirty looks and whispered insults. I climbed out of the wagon, my shoulders hunched and my eyes downcast, fully expecting to see Sable's familiar sneer or feel the icy stares of the other women. But as I walked toward the communal fire to gather what I needed for breakfast, I realized something was fundamentally different. The atmosphere in the camp had shifted entirely. The sneering looks were gone. Instead of the heavy aversion I had grown used to, there was a strange, hurried politeness that felt even more unsettling. When I reached for the water bucket, Odell, who usually made a point of ignoring me, stepped aside so quickly he nearly tripped. He gestured for me to go first, his eyes fixed firmly on his own boots, as if looking at me directly might cause him physical harm. Even more shocking was Sable herself. She was sitting by the supply cart, and when our eyes met, she did not look away with her usual disgust. She swallowed hard, her face pale, and offered a small, stiff nod. Good morning, Maris, she said, her voice sounding a bit strangled and thin. I stood there for a second, blinking in genuine confusion. Good morning, Sable. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, watching as the people who had treated me like a plague bearer the day before now went out of their way to be civil. They did not linger near me, and they certainly did not seek out conversation, but the act of loathing had been replaced by a quiet, vibrating caution. It was the way people treated a sleeping predator. I looked for Ryke, wanting to ask him what had happened during the night watch, but he was busy at the front of the convoy. He was riding with the scouts, his face a mask of cold indifference that gave away nothing. 2 days later, the eerie peace was interrupted by a different kind of tension. It was early morning, the thick mist still clinging to the ground and obscuring the horizon, when I saw Ryke standing at the very edge of the camp. He was looking out toward the trail we had just traveled, his posture rigid and his eyes scanning the distance with a predatory focus. He looked more like the general of the Iron Legion than the merchant's brother in that moment, his silhouette sharp against the rising sun. I poured a cup of coffee and walked over to him, the steam rising into the cold morning air. He took the cup without looking at me, but he drew me closer to his side. I wrapped my arm around his waist, inhaling the familiar scent of wood smoke and leather as he inhaled the scent of my hair. He took a slow sip of the coffee, his eyes never leaving the horizon. What is it? I asked softly, sensing the alarm in his muscles. We are being tailed, he replied, his voice barely a whisper that didn't carry past my ear. Small group. Fast. They have been keeping their distance for 3 miles, but they are closing the gap now. They think the mist is hiding them. Before I could ask more, Robin joined us. The wagon master looked tired, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, but he followed Ryke's gaze with a sharp intelligence. He didn't need to ask what Ryke was looking at. A man like Robin survived by sensing the same threats. Bandits? Robin asked, his voice low. A small group, 15 of them, Ryke said, his voice cold and analytical, as if he were counting supplies rather than men. They are scouts for a larger raiding party, most likely. They think we are an easy target because of the number of family wagons and the slow pace of the oxen. They are waiting for the right moment to hit the rear. Robin swore under his breath, a string of curses that reflected the dire situation. He signaled for the chief of security, a barrel-chested man named Kale, who who had been skeptical of Ryke since the moment we joined. Kale arrived with a hand resting heavily on his sword hilt, looking annoyed at being called away from his breakfast. He had always been a man who valued muscle over intuition. "What is the problem now?" Kale asked, his voice booming and arrogant. 15 bandits on our tail," Robin explained, gesturing toward the rolling hills behind us. "Ryke says they will strike soon. We need to tighten the perimeter and prepare for a night assault." Kale looked out at the empty horizon, squinting through the mist, and then turned back to Ryke with a mocking smile touching his lips. "I do not see anything but grass and fog. Maybe the northerner is seeing ghosts in the mist to make himself feel important. My men are seasoned. We can handle a few scavengers if they actually decide to show up. We do not need to panic the women over a shadow." Ryke did not even blink at the insult. He did not grow angry or defensive. He simply turned to look Kale directly in the eye, and I saw the security chief flinch under the weight of that stare. It was the look of a man who had seen the end of the world and survived it. "I can handle all 15 of them alone," Ryke said, his voice flat and devoid of any ego. "And I will do it tonight. I do not want them bringing their friends to the camp while my woman is sleeping." "I do not want the noise," Kale laughed, a loud, booming sound that drew eyes from all across the camp. "You? Alone? Against 15 armed raiders in the dark? You will be dead before you even clear the first ridge. I will bet my best horse you do not even find them, let alone stop them." "If I do it, you stay out of my way for the rest of the trip," Ryke countered, his voice like iron. "And you stop questioning my word. You listen when I speak." "Deal," Kale said, still grinning and shaking his head. "I would love to see you try. It will be a short walk and a long climb back when you realize the mist is empty." That night, Ryke did not join me in the wagon. The intimacy of the previous nights felt like a memory from a different life. He did not take a sword from the armory or a heavy shield from the supplies. He simply checked the long knife in his boot, kissed me hard on the mouth with a lingering intensity, and vanished into the darkness beyond the campfire light. I stayed awake for hours, sitting on the edge of the bed, my ears straining for any sound. I expected the clash of steel, the screams of men, or the sound of horses, but the plains remained deathly silent. The night was a void that had swallowed him whole. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting long, bloody streaks of red across the sky, when a shadow moved at the edge of the camp. I was already outside, pacing by the wagon with my heart in my throat and my hands shaking. Ryke appeared through the morning mist, and for a heartbeat, I did not recognize him. He was covered in a dark, wet sheen that looked black in the low, early light. Sweat and blood soaked his shirt, clinging to the heavy muscles of his chest and arms. He walked with a steady, relentless gait, his face set in a grim expression that made my blood run cold. He didn't look like a savior. He looked like a nightmare. He walked straight to the center of the camp, where Robin and Kale were waiting by the dying embers of the night fire. The entire camp had begun to stir, drawn by the silent, terrifying sight of the bloody man returning from the dark. People climbed out of their wagons, children were pulled back behind canvas flaps, and a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the grove. Ryke did not say a word to Kale. He did not boast or demand his horse. He simply reached into a leather satchel at his hip and dumped its contents onto the dirt at Kale's feet. 15 bloodied noses hit the ground with a sickening, wet thud, scattering in the dust. The silence that followed was absolute. I saw Kale turn a sickly, grayish shade of white, his bravado vanishing instantly as he stared at the grisly proof of Ryke's work. He looked as if he might be sick right there in the dirt. Robin did not look away, but his jaw tightened to the point of cracking, his eyes moving from the trophies to the man who had collected them. He looked at Ryke with a new understanding, a recognition of the monster he had allowed into his convoy. "They won't be bringing any friends," Ryke said, his voice raspy and cold, sounding like stones grinding together. He turned and walked toward me, the crowd of travelers parting like the sea before a storm. No one spoke a word. No one moved to stop him. The air in the camp had shifted once again, but this time it was not suspicion or moral outrage. It was a terrifying, bone-deep awe. They finally saw what I had seen in that mud pit weeks ago. They saw the general. They saw the man who had broken armies. They saw the warlord. As he reached me, I did not pull away from the blood or the sharp metallic scent of death that clung to him. I took his hand, my fingers becoming stained by the dark red on his skin, and led him back toward the privacy of our wagon. I knew then that our lives in the convoy would never be the same. We were no longer travelers seeking a new start. We were a force of nature they had merely invited along for the ride, a pair of ghosts that could kill as easily as they breathed. The path to Andolin was clear now, but the cost was written in the red on Ryke's hands, and I knew the world would never let a man like him stay hidden for long. The rhythm of the road had changed once more, shifting from the jagged, icy silence of judgment to a quiet, efficient distance that felt almost like respect. As our wagon rolled toward the coast, the travelers no longer scattered when I approached the communal water barrels, and the whispered insults had vanished into the dust of our tracks. It was a relief, yet it felt artificial, like a theatrical performance where everyone had suddenly been handed a new script. I waited until we were alone on the high bench of the wagon, the horizon shimmering with the first hints of salt air, and the sky stretching out in an endless pale blue, to finally ask the question that had been burning in my mind for days. I watched Ryke's profile as he held the reins, his large hands relaxed but his eyes never ceasing their constant, predatory scan of the treeline. He seemed at peace in a way that most men only felt in their own homes, yet he was a man without a country. "How did you do it, Ryke?" I asked softly, my voice barely carrying over the creak of the wooden wheels and the rhythmic thud of the oxen's hooves. He didn't look at me, his gaze fixed on a distant ridge. "How did I do what, Maris?" "The camp. Everyone stopped treating us like we were carrying a plague. Sable actually spoke to me yesterday, without looking like she wanted to vomit. Odell gave me extra grain for the horses. People are polite. It isn't natural, not after what they know happened at the river." Ryke shrugged, his broad shoulders shifting beneath his travel-worn tunic. "I did nothing special. I grew tired of seeing you flinch every time you stepped out of the wagon. I simply mentioned to Robin that his people were being assholes, and that he should make them stop it. I told him that if I had to listen to one more whisper about you, I would start removing the tongues that were wagging." He understood the urgency of the situation. He made them stop. I let out a small, breathless laugh, shaking my head in disbelief. "You told the wagon master his people were being assholes? That was your diplomatic solution?" "It was the truth," Ryke replied, finally turning his head to look at me. His amber eyes were clear and unwavering. "Men like Robin understand strength. They also understand that a quiet camp is a safe camp. He knew that if I was distracted by your unhappiness, I wouldn't be watching the horizon for bandits. It was a matter of logistics. He spoke to them, and they listened because they fear him, and they fear me even more." "I suppose it is effective," I murmured, leaning my head against his shoulder. The solid warmth of him was a constant anchor. "But it feels strange to have peace only because they are afraid of the consequences of their own cruelty." "Peace is rarely built on anything else, Maris," he said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "People are kind when it is easy. They are disciplined when it is necessary. As long as they leave you alone, I do not care what motivates their silence." The transition from the open, rolling plains to the bustling claustrophobic streets of Port-Olive was a shock to the senses. The air was no longer thick with the scent of dry grass and wood smoke. Instead, it was replaced by the sharp, biting tang of salt, the heavy stench of rotting fish, and the exotic, cloying aroma of expensive spices. It was a city of stone and secrets, a sprawling gateway between the crumbling martial power of Dhoran and the legendary scholarly peace of Andolin. We arrived under the cover of a gray, overcast afternoon, our dusty wagons blending into the chaotic stream of merchants, mercenaries, and desperate travelers flooding toward the docks. Robin moved with a frantic, focused energy I had not seen before. He seemed to know the layout of the port by heart, navigating the labyrinth of warehouses and pierheads with an authority that bypassed the usual bureaucratic delays. He spent hours whispering to dockmasters and sliding heavy pouches of gold into the hands of corrupt harbor guards. While he handled the logistics of our escape, Ryke and I moved through the crowded streets, keeping our hoods pulled low and our faces in the shadows. It was impossible not to notice the posters. They were everywhere, plastered onto the salt-stained stone walls of every tavern, granary, and government building. They were fresh, the ink still dark and tacky, crying out the news of the death of Commander General Ryke Vandross. The official proclamation was written in a cold, flowery script, claiming that the great warlord had succumbed to a sudden, violent fever following his final victory at the mud pits. It described him as a hero of the state, a loyal servant of the crown who had died in the service of the king. I stopped in my tracks, my heart skipping a beat as I read the words. I looked at Ryke, who was standing perfectly still in front of a particularly large poster. There was something haunting about watching a man read his own obituary. The artist had captured his likeness with terrifying precision, the harsh line of his jaw and the cold, unyielding light in his eyes preserved in charcoal and ink. To the world, the warlord was a ghost, a memory already being sanitized for the history books. "A sudden fever," Ryke muttered, his voice laced with a bitter, dangerous irony. "They couldn't even give me a soldier's death in their lies. A fever. How pathetic." "It is better this way," I whispered, reaching out to touch his arm. "If they think you are dead, they will stop looking. We can disappear." "They didn't do it for me, Maris," he said, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the image of his own face. "They did it for Finn. The new crown prince cannot have a living legend wandering the borders while he tries to consolidate his power. A dead hero is a useful tool. A living one is a threat." They have buried me so that Finn can stand on my grave. He reached out and tore a corner of the poster away, the parchment crinkling in his fist. Let them have their ghost. I have no use for that name anymore. We retreated into the shadows of the lower district, waiting for the cover of night so we could board the ship Robin had secured. The streets were slick with sea mist and the refuse of 1,000 travelers. We were navigating a narrow, damp alleyway toward a small apothecary where I hoped to find herbs for the sea crossing when the atmosphere shifted. I had stepped inside the small, cramped shop, the bell jingling softly above the door, but Ryke remained at the mouth of the alley. His instincts were a living thing, and I could tell by the way he tensed that he had sensed a predator in the fog. I moved quickly, gathering ginger root and dried mint, my eyes darting toward the window. I finished my purchase with trembling hands and slipped back toward the door, just in time to see a tall, lean man in the polished leather uniform of the port prefect stepping out from the shadows of a warehouse. He was flanking Ryke, his hand resting comfortably on the hilt of a fine, silver-etched sword. The man was Jameson. I recognized him from the stories Ryke had told me during the long nights on the road. He had been a subordinate of Ryke's in the Iron Legion, a man who had risen through the ranks not by merit, but by a cunning, sycophantic loyalty to the crown. He stood with the practiced arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. I told the boys it was a waste of ink, Jameson said, his voice smooth and dripping with a cruel satisfaction. He blocked Ryke's path, his boots clicking on the damp cobblestones. I told them that a bastard like Vandross doesn't die in a bed of fever. He's too stubborn to let a sickness take him. He'd have to be put down like a rabid dog. Ryke didn't move. He stood with his arms at his sides, his posture deceptively relaxed. You should have stayed in the capital, Jameson. The sea air doesn't suit you. Jameson laughed, a sharp, barking sound that echoed off the stone walls. Oh, I think it suits me just fine. Do you have any idea what Finn might offer for your head? The Crown Prince is quite anxious to ensure that his predecessor's favorite general stays buried while he secures his place. Perhaps gold, titles, a seat on the High Council. I could retire on the reward for just one of your ears, Ryke. He stepped closer, his eyes gleaming with greed and a long, simmering resentment. You always looked down on us. You and your precious code of honor. Look at you now, skulking in the mud with the common rats. You're nothing, and when I bring your head back to the palace, I'll be the one the bards sing about instead. I like the name Slayer for myself. I stayed in the darkness of the shop doorway, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Jameson was so consumed by his own monologue, so intoxicated by the prospect of his impending wealth, that he didn't even consider the possibility that Ryke wasn't alone. He saw a broken man in a travel-worn cloak, not a general with a partner. Ryke's hand twitched toward his belt, but I knew he was thinking about the consequences. If he killed a high-ranking official in this alley, the port would be locked down within minutes. The guards would swarm the docks, and our chance at Andolin would vanish. We would be hunted through the streets like animals. In a moment of pure, cold clarity, I realized that I was the only one who could end this without drawing the eyes of the city. Ryke had taught me how to move. He had taught me where the life was kept in the human body. He had given me a heavy, double-edged dagger and told me it was a tool of necessity. I reached into the hidden pocket of my cloak, my fingers closing around the cold, familiar hilt of the blade. I stepped out of the store, my movements silent and fueled by a desperate, protective fire. I didn't think about the woman I used to be, the slave who flinched and cowered. That woman was gone, left behind in the mud of the borderlands. I moved behind Jameson, who was still busy taunting Ryke with vivid descriptions of his execution. I didn't hesitate. I didn't let myself feel the weight of the life I was about to extinguish. I simply followed the map Ryke had etched into my mind during our training sessions. I sank the knife deep into Jameson's ribs from behind, a single, powerful blow that bypassed his leather armor and found the space between his ribs. I felt the sickening resistance of his flesh, and then the sudden, hot, wet release as the blade pierced his heart. I left the dagger in him, just as Ryke had instructed for a fatal strike that needed to stay quiet. Jameson's laughter died in a wet, choking gurgle. He turned slightly, his eyes wide and filled with a frantic, confused terror as he looked at me. He saw a woman with a hood and a steady hand, and then his legs gave out. He slumped against the damp stone wall and slid to the ground, his dark blood pooling quickly on the cobblestones. Ryke was at my side in an instant. He didn't look at the body with anything other than professional indifference. He grabbed my arm, his grip firm and grounding, pulling me away from the cooling corpse. Move, he commanded, his voice a low, urgent whisper. Do not look back, Maris. Just walk. We vanished into the labyrinth of the lower district, the sound of my own blood rushing in my ears drowning out the noise of the city. We didn't stop until we reached the shadowed pier where the Silver Gull was waiting. The following morning, we boarded the ship as the first light of dawn broke over the harbor, painting the water in shades of bruised purple and gold. The departure was tense, the air at the docks thick with an unspoken anxiety that felt like a physical weight. There was a visible increase in the number of harbor guards, and the sound of shouting echoed from the city gates. Word of the prefect's death hadn't spread yet, but the city was on edge. I stood by the wooden railing as the ship pulled away from the stone pier, my hood pulled low to hide my face. I listened to the traders from Andolin as they gathered in small groups on the deck. They were men of peace, their voices filled with a new and terrifying kind of dread. They spoke of the supreme king in Dhoran and his son, the Golden Prince. They whispered that the Empire's coffers were empty from years of war, and that they had set their sights on the prosperous, untouched kingdom of Andolin. "They say the Golden Prince has already mapped the coast," one merchant whispered, his hands shaking as he adjusted his silks. "Andolin has no walls. We have no formal army. We have only our ships and our libraries. What chance do we have against the Iron Legion?" "The king is old," another replied, his voice grim. "He believes in treaties and words, but you cannot negotiate with a wolf that is starving." The idea of the Iron Legion turning its predatory gaze towards such a defenseless paradise felt like a death sentence. It was during these whispered conversations that the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. We were standing near the captain's quarters, watching the coastline of Dhoran disappear into the mist, when a messenger in fine blue livery approached Robin. The man bowed so low, his forehead nearly touched the deck, and addressed him with a title that made my heart stop. Robin wasn't just a merchant or a wagon master who had taken a liking to us. He was an Andorian prince, the youngest son of the current sitting king. He had been traveling the trade routes undercover, not for profit, but to gauge the rising threat of the Empire for himself. He had seen the borders falling, and he had seen the quality of the men Dhoran was producing. He looked at us then, his eyes meeting Ryke's with a grim, heavy understanding. He knew exactly who Ryke was, and he had known since the beginning. He knew that a man like Ryke Vandross, a general who knew the inner workings of the Iron Legion, was the most valuable asset he could possibly bring back to his father's defenseless court. "I apologize for the deception," Robin said, his voice now carrying the natural weight of royalty. "But in these times, a prince must see the world as it truly is, not as his advisors describe it. We are going to need more than poets to save Andolin, General." Ryke stared at him, his jaw tight. "You used us. I gave you a path to safety," Robin countered, "and in return I expect your counsel. My father is a good man, but he does not understand the monster that is coming for us. You do." The 2 weeks we spent at sea were a blur of gray waves and cold, biting wind. We spent most of our time in the cramped, salt-scented quarters of the ship. The physical proximity between us was the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. I could still feel the phantom sensation of the knife sliding into Jameson's ribs, a memory that made my hands shake when I was alone. Ryke didn't speak of the alleyway, and neither did I, but the way he looked at me had changed. There was a profound, quiet calm in his eyes now, a recognition that I was no longer just the woman who had saved his life in the mud. I was a partner, who had killed for his survival. We were bound together by a secret that had no name. When the white cliffs of Andolin finally appeared on the horizon, they looked like something out of an ancient legend. They were high, brilliant, and capped with vibrant, lush greenery that seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight. The water was a clear, sapphire blue, a stark and beautiful contrast to the muddy, blood-soaked earth of the Dhoran borders. As the ship pulled into the harbor of the capital city, the sheer beauty of the place was overwhelming. The buildings were made of white stone and blue tile, draped in flowering vines that filled the air with a sweet, intoxicating scent. It felt like a kingdom that had never known a single day of sorrow. We walked down the wooden gangplank, our few belongings slung over our shoulders, looking around at our new surroundings with a mixture of desperate hope and lingering trepidation. The port was clean and orderly, filled with the sound of melodic music, and the laughter of people who didn't look over their shoulders. It felt like a dream. We were moving through the crowded plaza, trying to find our bearings, when the world seemed to freeze in place. An old woman with long, flowing blonde hair that reached all the way to her waist stood in the very center of the square. She was dressed in simple, elegant robes of white silk, her eyes milky from blindness but bright and piercing, as she looked directly through the crowd. Her gaze didn't flicker toward me, and she didn't look at the wealthy merchants or the returning sailors. Her focus was fixed entirely and solely on Ryke. She raised a shaking, slender hand and pointed toward him, her voice ringing out with a resonance that commanded the attention of every soul in the harbor. "Look!" she shouted, her voice echoing off the white stone walls. "The son of Flera returns to save us. The blood of the dawn has come home." The name Flera rippled through the crowd like a physical shockwave. The whispers started instantly, a low, buzzing sound of collective disbelief and sudden, frantic recognition. I watched in total, paralyzed shock as the people around us began to react. It wasn't the reaction of a crowd seeing a famous soldier. One by one, with a synchronicity that was haunting to behold, they began to kneel. The wealthy silk merchants, the rough sailors, the flower sellers, and the children, all of them dropped to their knees in the white dust of the plaza. Ryke and I turned back, our eyes wide as we looked at our fellow travelers from the convoy. We were stunned to see that even they were kneeling. Kale, the brothers who had guarded the wagons, and even Sable, all of them were on the ground with their heads bowed in deep reverence. And then I saw Robin, the Prince of Andolin, the man who had led us across the world and hidden his own crown, stepped forward. He did not stand as an equal. He lowered himself into a deep, formal kneel before Ryke, his head bowed. I looked at Ryke, who was standing as still as a statue, his face filled with a profound, terrifying confusion. The pieces of his mother's hidden history, the unique amber eyes he shared with the portraits of the ancient Andorian line, and the desperate, sudden prophecy of the old woman all crashed together in a single, world-shattering moment. He wasn't just a fallen general, or a bastard from a northern village. He was the son of the lost Princess Flera, and in the eyes of the people of Andolin, he was the only hope they had left to survive the coming storm. We had come to this kingdom to find a grave for our pasts, but instead, we had walked directly into the center of a kingdom that had been waiting for its king to return from the dead. The transformation was so absolute that it felt like a form of sorcery. For months, the scent of my life had been restricted to the sourness of the unending road and the suffocating dust of the Dhoran plains. My skin had been a map of bruises and grit, my short hair a nest of trail salt and despair. But this morning, as I sat at a table carved from pale, aromatic cedar, I smelled of crushed jasmine and expensive oils. My skin was dressed in a gown of the softest seafoam silk, a fabric so light it felt like a second, kinder layer of flesh. The palace of Andolin did not just house royalty, it breathed with it. Every corridor was an open lung of white stone and flowering vines, allowing the sapphire light of the sea to dance across the floors in patterns of liquid gold. I looked at Ryke, and for a heartbeat, I did not recognize the man sitting beside me. He had been scrubbed of the battlefield. The grime of the mud pits and the shadows of the borderlands had been washed away by steaming baths and scented soaps. Clad in a tunic of deep-sea blue with silver threading at the collar, he looked less like a tired soldier, and more like a god of old returned from a long, bitter exile. The jagged scar on his cheek was still there, a reminder of the wolf he had been, but his posture was different. He sat with the innate, terrifying grace of a predator who had finally found his rightful territory. King Philip sat at the head of the table, his face a map of refined sorrow and sudden, flickering hope. He did not possess Ryke's jagged intensity, but the family resemblance was undeniable in the shape of his brow and the steady, amber weight of his gaze. He watched Ryke eat with an expression that bordered on reverence, as if he were afraid his nephew might dissolve into mist if he looked away for too long. The breakfast before us was a feast of colors and scents that felt almost overwhelming after weeks of hardtack and dried meat. There were bowls of deep purple figs, honeyed cakes, and silver platters of grilled fish caught from the harbor only an hour prior. "We looked for you for 20 years, Ryke," Philip said, his voice thick with the resonance of a man who had finally put down a heavy burden. Every trading party, every whisper from the border, every shadow in the whole of the north was scrutinized. I never truly believed the earth could swallow a princess of Andolin and her heir without leaving a single trace. I sat in this very hall for decades, watching the ships come in, hoping one would carry the blue and silver of my sister's house. Ryke set his glass down, the silver ringing softly against the polished wood. The sound seemed to echo in the vast, airy room. Murmurs of raids reached the borders often during my time in the Legion. My mother once told me we were survivors of a disaster, but she had no names to give the ghosts. Her mind was a fractured thing, Philip. Tell me how it began. I want the truth, not the sanitized version the bards might sing. Philip leaned back, his eyes clouding with the weight of the memory. Your father, Drummond Wilhelm, was the finest navigator we had. He was the leader of the trading party, a man of such charisma that even the sea seemed to calm in his presence. Your mother, Flera, was my heart, my younger sister who saw only the good in a world that was already beginning to darken. When they planned that final expedition into Dhoran, I begged them to leave you here. You were an infant, a babe in a cradle of silk. I told them the north was shifting, that the newly installed king of Dhoran was growing restless and hungry for expansion. But Drummond was stubborn, and Flera was more so. She insisted they carry you with them one last time, before they decided to settle down in Andolin for good. She said she wanted you to see the world before the walls of a palace became your only horizon. He paused, a tremor in his hand as he reached for his tea. The steam rose in a delicate curl, caught in a shaft of morning sunlight. 6 weeks into their trip, the silence became deafening. The regular reports from the border ceased. Then came the whispers that turned into a roar. A trading party raided and slaughtered near the Dhoran interior. We sent a retrieval group immediately, but the Dhoran authorities were obstructive. They spoke of bandits and lawless territories, claiming they had no jurisdiction. It was a month before our men finally reached the site. They found the wagons burned to ash and the earth soaked in the blood of Andolin. They found the bodies of the guards and the servants. They found Drummond, his hand still gripping his sword. But there was no sign of Flera, and no sign of you. For almost 3 decades I have lived with the nightmare of that empty clearing, wondering if you were dead or something much worse. Ryke's expression remained a mask of iron, though I felt the tension radiating from him like a physical heat. His hand was clenched on the table, the knuckles white. The Supreme King found her, Ryke said, his voice cold and flat. He claimed he discovered a woman wandering the forest with a small child in her arms near the site of a massacre. He never mentioned the victims were Andorian. The trauma had locked her memories behind a wall she could never quite climb. All she could tell him was that she was certain she was from Andolin, and that my name was Ryke. He took us in, but not out of the kindness of his heart. He took her because he was captivated by her beauty, the king whispered, the words tasting like ash in the air. I knew the Supreme King in my youth. He was a man who collected beautiful things and broke them to see how they worked. Ryke nodded, a grim smile touching his lips. I have always believed he orchestrated the raid. He probably wanted the trade goods and the money they carried, but he also wanted the woman. He kept her as a trophy, a beautiful broken thing to decorate his court while I was raised in the shadow of his own sons. She died when I was 6 years old. The court physicians called it a wasting sickness, a failure of the spirit, but I knew the truth even then. I saw the way her hands shook. I saw the way her eyes clouded. She was being poisoned by the king's mistress, the woman who gave birth to Finn. That woman saw my mother as a threat to her own status, a rival for the king's fleeting attention. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the distant cry of a gull. Philip's face went pale, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the table. The horror of a princess of Andolin being treated as a concubine's rival was a stain on the crown he clearly felt deeply. I killed her, Ryke added. His voice was devoid of regret, as steady as if he were discussing a tactical maneuver. The mistress. I watched her for years, learning her habits, her vanity, the way she took her wine. When I was 13, I used the same slow, agonizing poison she had fed to my mother. I slipped it into her favorite vintage over the course of a month. No one knew. They thought she had caught the same sickness that took Flera. They buried her with honors while I stood in the back of the room, watching the dirt fall on her coffin. I have carried that blood on my hands since. Ryke finished, his eyes hard and unyielding. I could tell his first kill had always stayed with him, not as a source of guilt, but as the moment he realized the world only understood the language of consequences. Philip did not recoil. Instead, he reached across the table, placing his hand near Ryke's. In Andolin, we are people of peace, Ryke. But we are not fools. You did what a son of the dawn must do. You survived the den of the wolf, and you exacted justice where the law could not reach. You are more of an Andorian than you realize. We protect our own. Ryke looked up, his amber eyes piercing. How do you know for certain? How do you know I am not just a well-timed pretender with the right colored eyes and a story designed to fit your grief? Ravia is never wrong, Philip replied with a faint, knowing smile. The woman you saw at the port, the blind seer of the cliffs, never leaves her home, yet she has been waiting for you for the last 2 days. She stood in that plaza through the wind and the salt spray, because she felt the blood of the dawn approaching. No one in this city knew Robin was returning with a Dhoran warlord. Not even I knew the full extent of his suspicions. But Ravia knew. She saw the soul of a king beneath the cloak of a soldier, and she heard the song of your lineage before you even stepped off the boat. Philip gestured toward the sweeping murals on the dining room walls, depicting the history of the realm in vibrant blues, golds, and whites. Our laws of succession were forged in fire and blood, Ryke. Hundreds of years ago, Andolin kings believed they could keep the divinity of their line pure by marrying within the family. They thought they were preserving a godhood, but they were only inviting the rot. It almost wiped us out. The inbreeding made the kings brutal, sadistic, and physically frail. They became monsters in mind and body. The kingdom began to rot from the head down, and the people suffered under their madness. To save the realm, the Great Reformation was passed. Now the crown moves through the female line to ensure new blood is always present, to ensure the king is always anchored to the reality of the world. Because you have no sister, your son will be the future king, but it is your daughter who will produce the ultimate successor to the throne. You are the bridge, Ryke. The blood has returned to save the line from fading into the shadows of the past. I sat quietly, my hand instinctively resting on my stomach. The secret I carried felt like a leaden weight, a quiet storm brewing within me. I had planned to tell Ryke I was pregnant when we were safe, imagining a quiet life in a coastal cottage where the past couldn't find us. I had pictured him as a fisherman or a carpenter, a man who had finally laid down his sword. But now, he was the blood of the dawn. He was a future king of a prosperous ancient kingdom that looked at him as a savior. I looked at my own hands, scarred from labor and the grit of the road, the skin still slightly rough despite the oils. I was a former slave, a woman who had been bought and sold in the mud of Dhoran. How can a woman of the dust stand next to a king of the sun? The vision of our simple life was crumbling to dust, replaced by the terrifying gold and marble of a throne. I was terrified that if I stayed, I would eventually become a stain on his legacy, a reminder of the darkness he was meant to leave behind. Would the people of Andolin ever truly accept a woman who had known the inside of a cage? The gravity of the moment was broken by the entrance of a frantic page. The boy was breathless, his livery disheveled. Philip's expression hardened as the boy whispered in his ear, the king's face shifting from hope to a cold, regal fury. "The envoy from Dhoran," Philip explained, his voice turning grim as he dismissed the page. "He arrived a few days ago, before your ship touched the docks. He brought a message from the Supreme King. If we do not begin paying a heavy annual tribute in gold, grain, and timber, they will launch a full-scale invasion. They claim they will flatten our cities until the white stone is nothing but gravel for their roads. They call it a reclamation of the north." "And the envoy?" Ryke asked, his eyes sharp and calculating. "In the dungeons," Philip said. "I would not let a man threaten my people and then walk back to his master with a smile. We have already begun training our citizen militia and hiring mercenaries from the Southern Isles. But we are a nation of scholars, traders, and sailors, not conquerors. Our walls have not seen a siege in 300 years. Ryke stood up, his posture shifting into that of the commander I knew, the man who could lead an army into the mouth of hell and come out the other side. "I can help you fight them. I can drill your men until they move as one, until their fear is replaced by discipline. I can turn your mercenaries into a wall of iron that the Dhorans cannot break. I know their tactics, their weaknesses, and the pride that blinds them, but I will not take the throne, Philip. I am a killer, not a ruler. My hands are too stained for a crown." "We shall see," Philip murmured, his voice soft but persistent. "The crown has a way of finding the head it belongs to. For now, the wolf is at the door, and we must sharpen our teeth." Over the next month, we were moved into a beautiful manor on the outskirts of the capital. It was a place of fountains and silence, surrounded by olive groves and gardens that smelled of rosemary and sea salt. Yet Ryke was rarely there to enjoy it. He spent his days at the training yards, his voice echoing across the white stone as he grilled the soft Andorian soldiers. He was in his element, a storm of energy and focus. He drew complex battle plans on massive parchment maps, teaching the militia how to anticipate the brutal, heavy cavalry tactics of the Iron Legion. He was the warlord once more, focused, lethal, and entirely consumed by the coming conflict. I spent my time wandering the hills of Andolin, falling in love with the beauty of the place even as I felt more like a ghost within it. The air was sweet and clear, free of the smoke of the border fires. The people were kind, their voices melodic, and their laughter frequent. They treated me with a gentle curiosity, unaware of the child I carried, or the fear that haunted my heart. The threat of war felt like a distant thunderhead on a sunny day, something that couldn't possibly touch this paradise. Ryke's plan was calculated and brilliant. He knew the Dhorans didn't have enough ships to bring their entire army at once. The logistics of moving a force that size across the sea were immense. He believed they would have to send their most skilled warriors in waves, hoping to overwhelm the port before reinforcements could arrive. He spent nights staring at the coastline, mapping every cove and hidden beach. However, the peace was shattered when a spy report arrived 4 weeks later. I was in the garden, watching the sunset paint the white cliffs in shades of bruised orange and gold, when Ryke returned. His face was tight with a new kind of fury, a tension I hadn't seen since the river crossing. "The Supreme King has made a move I didn't anticipate," Ryke said, tossing a heavy leather scroll onto the stone table. "He has been busy while we were training. He has partnered with Prado. The Kingdom of Shipbuilders has lent him their entire navy in exchange for a share of our ports. They aren't coming in waves, Maris. They are coming all at once. A forest of masts on the horizon. They will reach our shores in 3 weeks, and they don't just want tribute anymore. They want to plunder Andolin until there is nothing left but the sea and the ruins." I looked at him, the weight of the unborn child suddenly feeling like an anchor. The world was shrinking again, closing in with the smell of salt and the sound of marching boots. The beauty of Andolin was no longer a sanctuary, it was a target, and the man I loved was the only thing standing between the sun and the dark. "Can we win?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Ryke looked out toward the ocean, his amber eyes reflecting the dying light. "We have to. There is nowhere else to run. The realization hit me then, sharp and cold. If Ryke fell, Andolin fell with him. If he survived, he would be a king. And in either world, the simple girl from the road was losing the man she had found in the mud. I placed my hand over my stomach, feeling the tiny, rhythmic pulse of a life that didn't yet know it was born into a war. I would have to tell him soon. I would have to tell the future king of Andolin that his legacy was already beginning, even as the world prepared to burn. The night air grew cold as the sun finally dipped below the horizon, leaving us in a twilight of uncertainty. The flowering vines around the manor seemed to pull back into the shadows. In 3 weeks, the sapphire sea would be choked with the black ships of Dhoran and the towering vessels of Prato. The scholars and sailors of Andolin were about to learn what Ryke had known his entire life, that peace is a fragile thing, bought with the blood of those who are willing to become monsters to protect it. "I will go to the docks tonight," Ryke said, his voice dropping to that low rumble that always sent a shiver through me. "We need to fortify the lower tiers. If they land at the harbor, we lose the city. We have to meet them at the water." "Be careful, Ryke," I said, reaching out to touch his arm. The silk of my sleeve brushed against the rough skin of his forearm. He turned to me, his expression softening for the briefest of moments. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against mine. "Stay within the manor walls, Maris. No matter what you hear from the city, stay where the guards can see you. I didn't bring you across a continent just to lose you to a Dhoran arrow." As he walked away, his cape billowing in the sea breeze, I watched him go with a heart full of unspoken truths. The palace, the manor, the silk, and the jasmine, they were all beautiful, but they were also a cage of a different kind. I was no longer a slave to a master, but I was becoming a slave to a destiny I hadn't chosen. And as the stars began to poke through the darkening sky, I wondered if the child within me would ever know the peace that Andolin had promised, or if they would only ever know the weight of a crown and the cost of a kingdom. The dawn did not break with the usual gentleness of the Andorian coast. Instead, the sky was the color of a fresh bruise, purple and swollen with the coming storm of iron and wood. I stood on the ramparts of the manor overlooking the harbor, my hands trembling as I watched the forest of masts swell on the horizon. The Prato ships were massive, their hulls painted a predatory black, while the Dhoran transports trailed behind them like a hungry pack of wolves. Ryke stood beside me, his armor gleaming in the pre-dawn light. He had abandoned his leather brigandine for a suit of Andorian silver plate, etched with the rising sun of House Wilhelm. He looked terrifyingly beautiful, a statue of war carved from the very spirit of the sea. He reached out to take my hand, his gauntlet cold against my skin. "Stay back from the cliffs, Maris," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to ground me. "The scholars have prepared the harbor, but if the Dhorans break through, the manor will be the first place they target." I nodded, but as the wind shifted, the sudden sharp scent of the salt air hit me. My stomach roiled with a violence that had become a constant companion over the last week. I tried to swallow the bile, but my body betrayed me. I doubled over, gripping the stone railing as I retched. Ryke was at my side in an instant, his heavy hand steadying my shoulders. "You are ill," he murmured, his brow furrowed with a sudden, sharp concern. "The stress of the month has taken too much from you. I will have the court physician brought to the manor." "It is not the stress," I gasped, the words tumbling out before I could catch them. I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand, looking up at him with eyes that were likely wild with the truth. "It is not the war, Ryke. I was going to tell you when it was over. I was going to tell you when we were safe." He froze. The hand on my shoulder tightened, not in malice, but in a sudden, electric realization. His amber eyes searched mine, moving down to the hand I had instinctively placed over the center of my body. The silence between us was louder than the distant drums of the approaching fleet. "How long?" he whispered, the word barely audible over the crashing waves below. 3 months, I replied. For a heartbeat, the Warlord vanished. The man who had been raised in the mud and the blood of the Legion looked at me with a vulnerability that broke my heart. He reached out, his metal fingertips brushing my cheek with a tenderness that did not belong on a battlefield. Then, the first horn of the harbor watch sounded. It was a long, mournful note that signaled the enemy had crossed the outer buoy. Ryke pulled back, his jaw setting into a hard, uncompromising line. He looked toward the sea, then back to me. "You have given me a reason to survive that has nothing to do with crowns or duty, Maris. Stay in the lower halls with the refugees. Do not come to the windows." He turned and strode away, his silver cape snapping in the wind. I watched him go, knowing that I had just sent a man to war with the weight of an entire legacy on his shoulders. As the battle began, I did not hide. I descended to the seaside gates of the manor, throwing them open. The people of the lower tiers, the fishmongers, the weavers, and the elderly who lived in the spray of the waves, were fleeing the docks in terror. I called to them, my voice echoing off the white stone. "Into the manor," I shouted, waving them toward the heavy oak doors. "There is bread and water in the kitchens. We have space in the cellars. No one is left behind." They came in waves, their faces pale with the fear of the Dhoran reputation. I spent the morning directing mothers to the soft rugs of the drawing room and the elderly to the warm hearths of the dining hall. I ignored the cramping in my legs and the exhaustion in my bones. If Ryke was fighting for the future of this land, I would protect the people who made it worth saving. In the harbor, the scholars of Andolin proved that knowledge was a deadlier weapon than any sword. They had spent weeks working in the secret laboratories of the Great Library, and today they unveiled their genius. As the first line of Prato ships entered the narrow throat of the bay, a series of submerged iron mirrors, angled by a complex system of gears, focused the morning sun into concentrated beams of white heat. The black sails of the lead ships did not just catch fire, they exploded into pillars of flame. Simultaneously, the scholars released the siphon. From the depths of the harbor floor, a mixture of pressurized oils and spirits, hidden in ceramic pipes, bubbled to the surface around the Dhoran transports. When the burning debris from the Prato ships fell into the water, the very sea turned into a lake of fire. The screams of the Dhoran soldiers reached the manor, a haunting melody of a dying empire. I stood in the doorway of the manor, watching the black smoke choke the horizon. The scholars had turned the geography of Andolin into a death trap. The Dhorans, used to the open plains and predictable rivers, had no defense against a sea that had been engineered to consume them. At the center of the chaos was the flagship of Andolin, the Dawn Treader. Standing at the prow was Ryke. He did not look like the betrayed bastard General Finn had mocked. He was Ryke Wilhelm, the heir of the Dawn, and he was leading a fleet of nimble Andorian cutters through the gaps in the burning wreckage. The Dhoran flagship, a massive, gold-plated monstrosity, attempted to turn, but it was snagged by the submerged chains the scholars had raised from the seabed. Ryke's ship pulled alongside it, and the boarding party surged over the rails. I heard the accounts later from the soldiers who survived. They said Finn stood on the deck of his gilded ship, his face a mask of disbelief as he saw the silver-armored commander leading the charge. Finn had expected a broken nation of poets. He found a man who had been forged in the same hell he had created, but who had come out of it with a soul of tempered steel. "You!" Finn screamed, his voice cracking as Ryke stepped onto the deck. "You are dead. The Legion left you in the mud." "The Legion made me," Ryke replied, his voice carrying across the deck like the crack of a whip. "And Andolin gave me a name worth fighting for. I am afraid you will not be able to go back home to Papa." The duel was short. Finn fought with the desperate, sloppy rage of a man who had never been told no. Ryke fought with the cold, surgical precision of a master. He did not play with his prey. He parried a wild swing from Finn's gold-hilted sword and drove his silver blade through Finn's chest in one fluid motion. Ryke did not look away as the life faded from Finn's eyes. He watched the man who had represented every misery of his youth slide off his blade. Then, Ryke turned to the Dhoran crew, his voice a roar that commanded the very air. "Lower your banners or join the sea," he commanded. By noon, 90% of the Dhoran and Prato fleet lay at the bottom of the harbor, or burned as blackened skeletons against the white cliffs. The victory was so absolute that it felt like a dream. The scholars had drowned an empire with mirrors and oil, and the Warlord had decapitated the snake. The sun was setting when Ryke returned to the manor. He was covered in soot and spray, his silver armor dented and stained with the dark blood of the Dhoran prince. He found me in the courtyard, where I was still handing out blankets to the last of the displaced families. He stopped at the gate, his chest heaving. The people in the courtyard fell silent, parting like the Red Sea as he walked toward me. He did not look like a king in that moment. He looked like a man who had walked through fire to find his way home. He reached me and stopped, his eyes searching mine. "The battle is over," he said, his voice ragged. "I know," I whispered. He looked around at the hundreds of people I had brought into the manor, at the children sleeping on the marble floors, and the wounded being tended to in the gardens. "You have been busy. You did more than hide." "I did what I could," I said. Ryke reached out, pulling me into his arms regardless of the blood and the ash on his clothes. He held me so tightly I could hear the frantic rhythm of his heart through his breastplate. I buried my face in his neck, the scent of smoke and jasmine mingling in the air. "I love you," he whispered against my hair. I have never said the words, because I did not think I had the right to feel them. But seeing the ships on the horizon, knowing you were here with our child, I realized that I would burn the entire world to the ground, just to see you smile one more time. He pulled back, his hands framing my face. His amber eyes were clear, the shadows of the Dhoran mud pits finally starting to fade. "I need to be honest with you, Maris," Ryke began. "Philip is old, and the people are already calling my name. Andolin is a peaceful, prosperous nation, but the Dhorans have shown the world that we are vulnerable. Others will try their luck now that the blood is in the water. I feel I owe it to these people to lead them, to build a wall they can stand behind. But I will not hold you here. I will not restrict you to a life of protocols and stone walls if your heart yearns for the road or a cottage by the cliffs. If you want to leave, I will give you everything you need to be safe and happy. I cannot leave, but you are free. I looked at him, at the man who had been my protector, my friend, and my silent strength. I looked at the people in the courtyard who were looking to us for a sign of what the future held. I thought about the woman of the dust I had been, and the woman of the dawn I was becoming. I do not want freedom if it means being without you, I said, my voice steady and certain. I was a slave in Dhoran, and I was a ghost on the road. But here, with you, I am whole. If you are to be the shield of Andolin, then I will be the heart that makes the shield worth carrying. Our child will not grow up in the mud, Ryke. They will grow up in the sun. Ryke let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a lifetime. He leaned down, kissing me with a desperate, beautiful intensity. In that kiss, the road ended. The war ended. The hunger and the fear were washed away by the tide. We stood together on the white stone of Andolin as the stars began to appear over the sapphire sea. The palace behind us breathed with the hope of a new era, and the harbor below was finally still. The warlord and the slave were gone, replaced by a king and his partner, ready to build a kingdom where no one would ever have to fear the darkness again. The blood of the dawn had returned, and for the first time in over 20 years, the morning promised to be bright. The end. That concludes the story of Maris and Ryke. If you enjoyed this story, make sure you like this video and subscribe to show your support. If you love epic adventures and romance, make sure to check out the one on your screen right now. Thanks for listening, and I will see you in the next world. Bye.